Hello everyone and welcome to the University of Queensland Faculty of Health and Behavioural Sciences Alumni webinar series. My name is Paul Purcell and today we'll be joined by Professor Wayne Hall from the UQ National Centre for Youth Substance Use Research. Wayne has a wealth of experience in this field and we'll discuss some interesting topics today. He's held titles of Professor at the National Addiction Centre at King's College in London and Director of the Centre for Youth Substance Abuse Research, among many others. Additionally, he's advised the World Health Organization on a variety of topics, including the health effects of cannabis use and the effectiveness of drug substitution treatment. I begin today by acknowledging the traditional owners and their custodianship of the various different lands on which we all meet. On behalf of the university, I pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. We recognise their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. For those of you joining us live today, you're encouraged to ask questions during the webinar using the Q&A function you'll find at the bottom of your screen. We'll endeavour to address these at the conclusion of the presentation. This webinar is also being recorded and will become accessible via the HaBS Alumni webpage, along with all the previous episodes in this series. And now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Wayne Hall.
Thank you, Paul, and thanks for the invitation to speak. I guess I'd begin by making some declarations of interests, as is customary these days. I don't have any shares in any of these drugs, but I have been involved in the issues around them in a US Supreme Court case that approved the religious use of a psychedelic plant called ayahuasca, and I've collaborated with two leading figures who, as we'll hear later, are actively involved in research on psychedelic drugs at present. I guess countering those sorts of indicators that might suggest I'm positively disposed, as I was a young adult during the psychedelic era, so a lot of personal experience with some of the craziness that we'll hear about later that went on around these drugs in the 60s and 70s. So what are psychedelic drugs? Well, the classic psychedelics are LSD, lysergic acid, as it's often known, psilocybin, mescaline, and dimethyltryptamine, or DMT. There's a variety of other drugs that are variously included in the category of psychedelics, one of which is MDMA. I won't attempt to pronounce its full name, and ketamine, and there's a variety of other drugs that are sometimes counted. I'll be primarily concentrating on the classic psychedelics and MDMA in this talk. These drugs produce profound visual experiences, what are often described as pseudo hallucinations. They're not true hallucinations in that people don't see things that aren't there, they just see unusual illusions that arise from ordinary everyday visual experience, and they do experience synesthesias, seeing voices or sounds and hearing colours and so on. Users often report oceanic feelings and ego dissolution and the experience of ineffable mystical experiences.
Wayne, I'm sorry to interrupt. So
Yes.
we've just got a slight issue. I'm just going to see if we can resolve it. A few people have commented that they're struggling with the size of the PowerPoint screen. It's not coming up to scale. We might just quickly have another go at just updating that. Did you want to just quickly just try sharing your screen again from the presentation mode and see if that will work?
Okay.
I apologise about this, everyone. We'll hopefully have this resolved.
Is that any better?
We'll just double check. I'll just see how this is looking. It's going to come up with your notes on there, but by the same token, it should show the whole screen at least. So we'll go like that, and yeah, that way people can still see the
There
PowerPoint.
are no notes, so it should be okay.
Okay, great.
All right. I think I was talking about the typical effects of psychedelic drugs, and the ones that are best studied are LSD and psilocybin. These are known to act on a particular set of receptors in the serotonin system, because we know that the effects of the drugs are blocked if drugs which act or block these receptors are administered to people. They also have a profound range of other effects on neurotransmitter systems that are not well understood and are still being investigated. Oops. The major indications of renewed interest in these drugs has been since about 2000. A variety of people have started doing clinical trials to evaluate the effectiveness of these drugs in treating primarily things like anxiety in people who are terminally ill, intractable depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and addictions. There's also been growing neuroscience research on how these drugs act on the human brain, in particular the major receptor systems, and more recently how they act on connected networks of neurotransmitter systems in the human brain. There's also been a lot of social science and historical interest in early research that was done in the 1950s and 60s, and interest in why that research came to an end and the role that the so-called counterculture played. There's also been some very interesting ethnographic research where researchers have spent time working in laboratories and studied researchers in this area as if you would people of a foreign culture. The Western discovery of these drugs is really a phenomenon beginning in the 1940s and 50s. We know that a lot of these plants were used by the indigenous peoples of the Americas for probably millennia, and they've discovered that various mushrooms, cacti, and seeds, particularly morning glory seeds, produced hallucinations, which they'd often use for religious purposes. The Spanish missionaries that followed the conquistadors into the Americas strongly discouraged the use of these drugs, which they regarded as satanic, because they produced sort of hallucinations and strange visions. The first drug to be extracted was mescaline from peyote cactus in the late 1890s, and it was synthesized in the early 20th century. There were quite a number of eminent medical practitioners who took the drug in the early part of the 20th century and just published in leading medical journals their experiences. There's Havelock Ellis and Weir Mitchell and Heinrich Kluwer. LSD wasn't discovered until 1943 by Albert Hofmann, who was a chemist at Sandoz in Basel, Switzerland. He accidentally discovered it by absorbing it through the skin and had the first unplanned LSD trip while riding on a bicycle. That's often described in the literature. Sandoz, the company he worked for, took out a patent on the drug. They couldn't see an obvious medical use, so they provided it free to medical practitioners to experiment with. Hoffman also isolated psilocybin, the active ingredient in hallucinogenic or magic mushrooms, at a later date. This is Hoffman in a sort of psychedelic style portrait. Here's the discovery of LSD, and these are the mushrooms that contain the psilocybin, which is a hallucinogen. The therapeutic interest in these drugs really began in the 1950s in the unlikely place of Saskatchewan in Canada, where a British psychiatrist, Osmond, and a Canadian psychiatrist, Hoffer, began to use LSD to treat alcohol dependence, or alcoholism as they called it in that period in the late 1950s. They were looking for an effective drug treatment for this illness, and they hypothesized that giving alcoholics a very large dose of LSD would scare them into sobriety. And they assumed that what would happen is what often happens when alcoholics go through severe alcohol withdrawal and experience delirium tremens or DTs, during which they can experience hallucinations, which are often frightening and a potent incentive that people often have for stopping drinking. What they found instead of producing the DTs was that their patients reported mystical experiences that were sort of an epiphany that helped them realize that they were really doing a lot of damage to themselves and their families and children and so on by continuing to drink. And they evolved this treatment that they described as psychedelic therapy, which involved giving their patients a very large, high dose, relatively speaking, because the doses of LSD are measured in the micrograms rather than milligrams, 400 to 500 micrograms of LSD, that pretty reliably produced these mystical experiences. They also encouraged their patients to engage with Alcoholics Anonymous after treatment, and they did follow-ups of their early treatment, reporting that 50% of their patients were still abstinent 6 months after the treatment. these results seemed pretty fabulous, and there were the people who were keen to embrace the treatment, but there was also a lot of skepticism within the field because these were uncontrolled studies that typically involved fairly small numbers of patients. There were no comparison groups, so we didn't know what would have happened in the absence of this treatment. And the outcomes of treatment were not blindly assessed. They were typically assessed by the therapists who followed patients up and asked how they were going. And the main outcome was a self-reported abstinence after 6 to 12 months, which clearly depended on the patients telling the truth and the clinicians not exaggerating their results. And the fact that they'd all used LSD and were publicly reporting this created a fair amount of skepticism about their objectivity. There were subsequently a series of randomized controlled trials, the first one of which was done at the Addiction Research Foundation in Toronto, but largely failed to replicate their good results. They compared two groups, a group given LSD and a group given ephedrine. What they found was that both groups were substantially improved. There was no difference in outcome. Osman and Hoffer argued that this study hadn't really tested their treatment because it just simply gave patients the drug without any of the accompanying therapy, without any encouragement to enroll in AA. But they undoubtedly harmed their cause by making very strong claims about the efficacy of the treatment, defending their treatment in the face of failures to replicate. And they also were fairly unwise in affiliating with individuals who we hear about at the moment, Timothy Leary and Aldous Huxley, who were fairly enthusiastic advocates of non-medical use. If we look in retrospect, as people have recently done, at looking at the whole series of studies that were done over the period of the 1950s into the 60s, interest in this treatment tended to decline because the results of later studies were nowhere near as positive as those reported by Osman and Hoffer. But they did find some differences, and a recent meta-analysis of these studies did find that patients who were given LSD on the model of the Osman and Hoffer with active encouragement to engage with AA were doing much better at 3 to 6 months after treatment. But when they were followed for longer, typically for 12 months, the benefits of treatment tended to dissipate, so that there were no advantages in the longer term. So you might well ask, well, there was this treatment there, why did it get abandoned? Well, clearly one reason was people came to the view that it wasn't particularly effective, although perhaps they were a bit more skeptical than they should have been. The big factor that had a lot to do with discouraging research on this was what might be called the counterculture embrace of psychedelic drugs. Timothy Leary is, I guess, the most notorious celebrity or individual who took psychedelic mushrooms while he was on holiday in Mexico. He had an appointment at Harvard University where he set up what started off as research studies on the effects of psilocybin, the active ingredient in the mushrooms, and later LSD. The research quickly became pretty much a promotion of the use of these drugs for personal and spiritual enlightenment. And Harvard just basically terminated his employment, and he became a full-time sort of evangelist for the use of LSD, with the infamous slogan, tune in, turn on and drop out. He wasn't the only one, he's probably the most well-known, but Ken Kesey, the author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, was a similar advocate. He'd been given LSD when he was a student at Stanford University, and he staged electric Kool-Aid acid tests where people were given LSD in buckets of Kool-Aid and encouraged to freak freely, as he said. LSD became very much part of popular culture, popularised through music. The group The Doors, whose title came from Aldous Huxley's book, Jimi Hendrix, the Beach Boys, and of course the Beatles. And then that led into lots of community alarm and the banning of LSD in the mid to late 60s, and then the large-scale production of illicit LSD by colourful characters like Augustus Owsley Stanley III. It's Timothy Leary at the top and Hunter S. Thompson, another sort of LSD psychedelic drug enthusiast at the bottom. Ken Kesey and his bus that drove around the US promoting LSD use, and of course the Beatles Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band LP, which was heavily influenced by the Beatles' involvement with LSD in the middle 60s. There was a group, the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, which was a large-scale illicit manufacturer of LSD that was involved in springing Timothy Leary from prison in the late 1960s. The other aspect of psychedelic drug use in this period was the predilection for people who used it to get involved in various cults. Charles Manson was the most infamous, with his family in Los Angeles that committed some particularly gruesome murders in Los Angeles in 1969. But they weren't the only one. We had an Australian family in Melbourne that also used LSD to convince the followers that the leader, Anne Hamilton Burns, was a reincarnation of Christ. Carlos Castaneda, who published a whole series of best-selling books on the use of psychedelic drugs to access an alternative reality, ended up forming a cult some of whose members committed suicide when he died. But it wasn't just all the peace and love movement. The Weatherman Underground, which was a left-wing group that committed bombings, bank robberies and killings, were also enthusiastic users of LSD, as they saw as a potential revolutionary drug. And the Rajneesh, the Bhagwan, the Orange people, it was a love cult that ran on MDMA rather than LSD. So these drugs have not a great history, and nor is it confined to people acting outside the mainstream. There are also some pretty unsavory uses of LSD by the CIA and the US and the US Army, which involved experimenting on people without their knowledge or consent. And a lot of exposure of that in the late 1970s had a lot to do with giving these drugs a very bad name. So they came to be abandoned in large part because of cultural disapproval of this sorts of behaviour that went around it. But there are other unappreciated factors, one of which was the tighter regulation of clinical research after the thalidomide scandal in the early 1960s. Whereas it used to be easy for researchers just simply to give drugs to patients to see what happened without any ethical oversight or any clinical trial protocol, the Congress passed legislation and the FDA enforced it that required people to have evidence for the safety of these drugs before they could be used with patients, and to have clinical trial protocols and ethics approval, and to conduct randomized controlled trials. The drug company Sandoz decided not to supply LSD after the mid-1960s, except to university-funded researchers, largely because of the fuss and the threat to their reputation for the misuse of the drug in the counterculture. Their patent had also expired, so they had very little to gain from funding further research. So what's brought about the revival of research? There's been a number of influential individuals who've campaigned for a very long time to allow the use of these drugs for therapeutic purposes. Some of these individuals were around in the late 1960s and affiliated with some of the early researchers. Many of them have had what they describe as transformative personal experiences with psychedelic drugs. Some of them hope that medicalisation is the way to secure the legalisation of these drugs for adult use. And there's a variety of philanthropists, many of whom have used LSD in the past, particularly from Silicon Valley, who are funding a lot of this research at the moment. What's different about it this time around is that it's being done by very senior people in leading research universities in the US, the UK and the EU, and they're determined to conduct randomised controlled trials to the standards required by the FDA to ensure approval of these drugs for medical use. They're also doing neuroimaging studies to better understand their mechanisms of action, and they've started publishing the results of these research studies in pretty high impact peer-reviewed journals. So some of the individuals involved, Rick Doblin, Bob Jesse, and Amanda Fielding, they're a mixture of US and British researchers, and they've managed to recruit very high profile senior researchers in various areas who've got the intellectual capital and reputation that they're prepared to use to do research on what is still a fairly suspect topic for a large number of people. More sympathetic histories of earlier psychedelic research have enabled that, and the fact that the Food and Drug Administration had designated two psychedelics, psilocybin and MDMA, as potential breakthrough treatments has made it a bit easier to do research. There's also a lot more neuroscience research which is legitimising clinical interest in these drugs by showing that they do have very interesting effects on brain function in ways that may well have therapeutic applications. Doblin is very interesting. He's probably been around longest. He's actually made it his life's mission to get one of these drugs approved for therapeutic use. He's now in his late 60s. He's been doing this since the 1980s. David Nichols is someone of a similar age who has had a long-standing interest, who's now getting towards retirement but prepared to get involved in this research, as is Roland Griffiths. Amanda Feeling and David Nutter in the UK are very similar senior people in this sort of area who've moved into doing research on psychedelic drugs. So what type of research is being done? Well, clinical trials using psilocybin rather than LSD. The reason for choosing this drug is that it has a shorter period of action. It's got a simpler pharmacology, produces fewer bad trips, and it has none of the cultural baggage affiliated with it that LSD carries. The researchers that are doing this don't advocate non-medical use, and they're fairly careful in the claims that they make about the drugs, and they've chosen to study the same sorts of disorders that the early researchers did: depression, anxiety, alcoholism, smoking cessation, and obsessive compulsive disorder. There's also been some interest in studying the spiritual effects of these drugs in people with terminal illnesses and in normal volunteers. And the best evidence to date is in favour of psilocybin in the treatment of anxiety and depression, which is why the FDA has given it this sort of breakthrough status. And it's done the same for MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for post-traumatic stress disorder, in the case that's largely been run by Rick Doblin. So how effective are these drugs? Well, you can imagine there are challenges in doing randomised controlled trials that involve double-blind placebo, because it's pretty easy to distinguish the effects of a psychedelic drug from a placebo, even an active placebo that might have short-term effects. So it's been difficult to comply with the requirements for normal randomised controlled trials. The studies that have been done to date have largely been positive in showing benefits in the short to medium term from these drugs in these conditions. The major reservation that a lot of us have is that they've been conducted by people who are advocates of the use of these drugs. And a lot of us sort of like to see these results reproduced by others who are perhaps not as committed to the use of these drugs as the early advocates have been. And the longer term follow-ups are what we need at the moment, because we know that new treatments typically tend to look a lot better early on in their use, shortly after they've been introduced into clinical practice, particularly when trial numbers are fairly small. Patients, researchers are enthusiastic about the treatment, and patients are often selected in ways that tend to make the treatment look a bit better than it might do when it's used in more widespread in routine clinical practice. So in the case of the psilocybin, the treatment of depression, there's a small number of trials with some fairly small sample sizes in the randomised controlled trials, largely because it's been difficult to get, in the absence of pharmaceutical company funding, to get the money to do large-scale trials that will be needed for clinical approval by the FDA for clinical use. So the treatment in the case of psilocybin typically involves giving people 1 or 2 doses of the drug, using a guided experience session with psychotherapists to provide support, often followed by some brief psychotherapy to talk about the experiences that people had while taking the drug. And what's been reported in these early trials is very large, immediate and clinically significant reductions in depressive symptoms, including in people who've been treatment resistant, that is, who failed to respond to more conventional antidepressant drugs and treatment. So some of these studies have reported as much as 70% of the patients have shown a full clinical remission from depression, and that this has been sustained in a fair proportion of these patients up to 12 months. There's also been the observation that patients do better if they report these mystical experiences that psilocybin tends to produce in many people. MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for post-traumatic stress disorder. This involves using the MDMA to facilitate psychotherapy. It tends to be psychotherapy non-directive, what I describe as psychodynamic light. That is, it is focused on the sorts of material that's thrown up in the MDMA sessions, typically around the traumatic experiences that people have had that have led them to develop post-traumatic stress disorders. Again, there's three studies that have been done, phase 2 studies, reasonably small, but the results have all been very, very positive. And the FDA has encouraged the researchers to do larger scale trials with the prospect of approving medical use of this drug if the results in the phase 2 trials hold up in the phase 3 studies. The problem, of course, as I've already mentioned, is that there's no drug company interested in funding these trials because these drugs are well out of patent. So the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, which Doblin heads, is attempting to patent not the drug per se, but the package of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, and seeking a monopoly on training and licensing psychotherapists to deliver it. So how safe are these drugs? We know that in the 1960s, supervised medical use was reported to produce adverse effects fairly rarely, but there's a bit of a worry that they may have been underreported. Doblin has done a long-term follow-up study of one of the very early studies, the Good Friday experiment, that involved giving theology students psilocybin to provoke mystical experiences, and one of the 10 participants in that did have a psychotic episode that required medication that wasn't described in the original report. We know that adverse events were very commonly reported in the 1960s among people who were using the drug recreationally. It was much harder to get a handle on how common these adverse events were and how directly related they were to the use of these drugs. Because young people who are disturbed often have a predilection for using drugs of this sort. So separating the pre-existing risk from the risk associated with the drug can be difficult. There was also a flurry of research in the 1960s suggesting that LSD produced genetic damage, largely studies in mice that were not supported in well-controlled studies. But those studies weren't done until well after LSD had been banned, the non-medical use had been banned. We do know that there's continued use of these drugs illicitly. Recreational users do continue to use LSD. Very rarely do they report serious adverse events. They just don't seem to come up. And in surveys, people who report LSD use typically tend to have better mental health than other illicit drug users who don't use the drug. Probably a selection effect rather than an effect of the drug, but that's an interesting observation that people have made. There's also been follow-up of people involved in the clinical trials and laboratory studies of these drugs, and adverse events have been rarely reported amongst those groups, anxiety being the most common. So how likely is it we'll see the medical approval of psychedelic drugs? Well, I think it's quite likely in the case of psilocybin and MDMA. The big caveat here is whether the larger scale clinical trials produce results that are as good as those in the smaller scale studies. If they do, it's very likely that those drugs will be approved. And then I guess the issues will become, if they're approved as a treatment for intractable depression, will we allow their use first line? That is, will people be allowed to be treated with these drugs for depression without having had to fail to respond to existing antidepressant drugs? If patients relapse, how often is it safe to continue to re-administer these drugs? And who should we allow to prescribe it? Any family doctor or specialists and psychiatrists only? In the case of MDMA and post-traumatic stress disorder, the major issue here is you're talking about 15 to 30 hours of psychotherapy wrapped around 2 or 3 sessions of administering the drug. This is a pretty costly treatment option, which is only really going to be available for the very rich and in the US for veterans of administration patients who develop PTSD as a result of war service. One can foresee pressure for wider access and greater shortening of treatment. There's not a lot of good evidence that you get additional benefits from longer term psychotherapy, and it may be much more effective to combine MDMA with shorter term traditional exposure based therapies for these conditions. So what are the regulatory futures for these? Will psychedelics follow the example of medical cannabis, that enthusiasm for their medical use will get well ahead of any of the evidence? Will we see these drugs being made available for compassionate access to treat anxiety disorders, addiction, OCD, PTSD, and terminal illness? Will we be under pressure to allow the compassionate use of other psychedelic drugs which haven't been evaluated, such as LSD, mescaline, and DMT? Or will we see people being allowed to engage in what's described as microdosing, that is using very low doses of LSD daily to improve their wellness and creativity? And will we see pressure for the use of plant forms of psychedelics, such as ayahuasca, which is an Amazonian plant that contains DMT, or ibogaine, an African root that has psychedelic drugs in it? And will we see pressure for the liberalisation of psychedelic use, basically for spiritual purposes, and indeed the legalisation of adult use? I'll finish there. So thanks very much, and I look forward to any questions for those who've got the time to stick around and hear.
Wayne, that was fantastic. Thank you very much. We do have quite a few questions that have come through. So what I'm going to do is I'll just go through a couple of them with you, if you don't mind, and then we'll go from there. But I'll just I'll take this off here so we can see you a little bit better. The first question I've got here is, what's actually happening from an Australian perspective in this space?
Well, there is an Australian organisation that's been set up that's intending to organise clinical trials here, and they're in fact offering to train people in the use of psilocybin and MDMA in anticipation of the approving these drugs. And then the major obstacle here in Australia will be, I think, legislative change required to allow the medical use, because at the moment these drugs are in a schedule which doesn't permit medical use, and this was what was required to permit the medical use of cannabis, for example. So something similar, I suspect, would be required to enable that to happen. But there's certainly groups here. The groups I'm aware of, David Nutt has visited Australia and given talks. There are connections between the Australian groups and those in the US and the UK. So there is a growing international movement gathering momentum, pushing for the medical use of these drugs, and particularly the use for compassionate reasons.
Okay. Thank you. A bit of a left field one here. If LSD was discovered today in the modern era, how do you think society would approach it? Do you think it would be different?
Bit hard to know. I mean, we've discovered lots of other drugs with similar effects. Well, I guess the short answer was Sandoz didn't know what to do with it. They looked for various therapeutic uses and couldn't find any. So they basically let it out into medical practice. They provided it freely to medical practitioners, and their suggested uses were, pretty dated. I mean, psychoanalytic psychotherapy was all the rage in the 1950s and 60s. And so the first people to use it were psychodynamically oriented people who used LSD to access people's unconscious sources of conflicts and to treat in that way. Psycholytic psychotherapy was the name given to that particular approach. But that didn't really catch on much outside Europe as an approach. And I think inevitably we see that happen with other drugs. If drugs have interesting psychoactive effects and be used in medical practice, then word will get around fairly quickly. There's bunches of so-called psychonauts out there looking for interesting drug effects from prescribed medications, and we periodically see drugs that, on the face of it, wouldn't have abuse potential, but people do discover that if you take multiples of the recommended therapeutic dose, they have interesting effects. So quetiapine, for example, which is an antipsychotic agent, is a drug that is abused by some illicit drug users.
Thank you. We've got another one here. Although efficacy of LSD-assisted therapy, for example, in alcoholism, might diminish over time, is there any reason not to repeat treatment periodically to push the reset button, as it may?
Well, that was certainly what Osman ended up recommending, and I mean, that certainly would be worth thinking about, giving people sort of booster sessions, as it were. And we certainly do that with other chronic illnesses. Probably wouldn't choose LSD because of its long action, but psilocybin could produce similar effects, or DMT. DMT, which is the psychoactive or psychedelic ingredient in ayahuasca, has been trialled on a small scale for alcohol dependence, and could be used in the same sort of way.
Great. We've got two, well, one's a comment, one's a question that sort of tie in together. The question is, does the university have any relationships with PRISM or Mind Medicine in Australia, or MAPS? And there's also a comment saying, could you please distinguish between PRISM and MMA, as they're two very different organisations?
Yeah, well, that's a bit of a commercial there. I didn't mention them by name, but they are groups that are actively involved in promoting interest in and medical use of these drugs, yes.
There's also a comment here saying there's some really good questions about regulation, but what are your thoughts? What would your suggestion be, or your answer be?
I mean, assuming that the clinical trials underway at the moment produce results as good as the early studies, then I'd be very supportive of approval for medical use of psilocybin and MDMA. I guess the challenge for the regulators always is keeping the cowboys out, because there'll be people who engage in fairly unethical practices will be attracted to using these drugs. So that, I guess, will be a challenge. And typically the public is fairly intolerant of any misbehaviour. So what we could easily see is what in fact happened in the 60s. I didn't go into in detail, but there was a fair amount of misuse of these drugs for medical purposes by people who are licensed practitioners. And in fact, Doblin talks about that, and one of the requirements of his particular form of psychotherapy is that they have two therapists, a male and a female, because of sexual misbehaviour by people who used MDMA in the 60s, typically male doctors with female patients. So I think that would be the challenge for medical use, and then I guess what may well happen is, if we see, as in fact is already happening in the US with citizen-initiated referenda to legalise the use of psilocybin-based mushrooms for medical, quote-unquote, medical and spiritual uses, we'll see these drugs out into the wider community. And again, the risk, and I think a lot of the people who are seriously involved in research are aware of these risks. Doblin has talked at some length on how to regulate these drugs in ways to minimise the potential misuses of the drug. And I think that will be the major challenge that we face.
Great, that's been fantastic. And I'll just wrap up with one last question, because I'm mindful of the time. We've got a question here saying, what are your thoughts about Rick Strassman's DMT study and encounters with the spiritual beings reported by those who took part?
Well, religiously I'm musical and tend to be fairly sceptical about the sort of experiences that people have on psychedelics. I mean, it's an interesting question as to whether the spiritual or mystical experiences that people report are an essential sort of effect of these drugs that's required for their therapeutic efficacy or not. David Nutt's talked about that in some detail. Or whether the mystical experience is really a sort of a marker of a dose that's adequate for producing the sort of therapeutic change that's required.
Well, that's great. Thank you, Wayne. And to be honest, it's been a fascinating presentation, and there's clearly a lot of interest from the Q&A. At this point, I'll apologise for those questions we didn't get to, but we will have to wrap up. But what we will do is we will send out an email with this recording, and that will come out to you probably early next week. Wayne, we'd like to thank you once again for your time today.
You're welcome.
And for those of you who joined us, we're very appreciative and we look forward to seeing you again in the future. Thank you.